Hi, everybody. I'm Ricardo Nunez, and I'm coming to you from the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And you're watching this probably because you're wanting to get an introduction into cooperative law, or really how the law is defined and applies to cooperatives. So, this is a presentation all about cooperatives for both attorneys and non-attorneys, and all and even though it's for both, there's going to be some parts that are going to be a little bit more technical and specifically for attorneys. So this is an MCLE after all. So you'll have access to all of these slides, and we've embedded links into the slide notes. So any of the resources that we talk about today, you'll be able to click through on the slides and see those resources. So we're going to be going over a lot of content. We're going to be covering a lot of ground. And when I say we, I mean myself, Ricardo Nunez, and my amazing friend and colleague and comrade, Hope Williams. So, and we're going to be co-presenting this introduction to cooperative law. So before we get into the cooperative law, I want to give a little shout out to our organization, Sustainable Economies Law Center. And we exist to bridge the gap in legal expertise needed to transition from destructive economic systems to innovative and cooperative alternatives. So our programs work together in identifying key leverage points in our existing economic and legal systems, removing strategic legal barriers, and creating replicable models for community resilience. We're going to be talking about some big ideas today, but even though we're going to be talking about big ideas, I also want to invite you, the viewer, to not let the limits of our imagination become the limits of your imagination. So we're still very much learning and evolving every day. We're going to be talking about some serious lawyer stuff, but before we jump into the training, I have a little disclaimer for you. So, a lot of the legal information we'll be providing today is generally applicable to many places across the United States, but we're mostly going to be talking about how cooperatives relate to California law. And laws vary from place to place and state to state. And law is complicated stuff. So, when you watch this video, some of this information could have become outdated. And although we've tried to collect accurate information and give the laws our best interpretation, some information could even turn out to be incorrect or subject to some other interpretation by courts or regulators. And in the moment, and when we get excited about the things that we're talking about, we might just say something that's plain wrong. So we sure hope that's not the case, but what can we say? So we strongly recommend that you do your own further research and welcome you to use our resources and even come to one of our resilient communities, legal cafes, where we provide legal support, legal education, and legal advice 3 times per month, and most of the time virtually. So you can join us from wherever you are. So, like I said, we're going to be covering a lot of ground today in our training. We're going to be providing an overview of why cooperatives exist and why they don't exist in greater numbers. We're going to be talking about what is a cooperative legally and otherwise, how they're defined. We're going to be talking about the different types of cooperatives that make up the cooperative ecosystem, the types of legal entities that cooperatives can use when they're forming a legal entity, how cooperatives relate to employment law, and what cooperative government governance looks like, and how money flows through a co-op. So that's a lot of ground to cover. We have done specific trainings on each and every one of these topics. And so we're not going to be going super deep into each one of these. We're just going to give you a little intro into how cooperative attorneys should be thinking about approaching these areas of law and where you can find more resources. So first, the what and why of cooperatives. So in this section, we're going to be discussing the thoughts and beliefs and practices that support the existence of co-ops and then how those thoughts, beliefs, and practices have been distilled into various corporate forms that you might interact with as an attorney or as someone wanting to start a cooperative. And so instead of starting with why cooperatives, I'd like to just take a step back and ask a broader question. Why democracy? Most people looking to build cooperatives see them as powerful mechanisms of change because of the democratic principles and values embedded in them. And certain values dictate the institutions that we create. And we know what the values are that underpin our current culture and our current economic system. And so when we are trying to understand the purpose of a system, we can say all the things that we want, but the only way to determine its values is by what it actually does. And so we have to reasonably conclude that the purpose of our existing dominant economy is the concentration and enclosure of wealth and power, regardless of consequence. We've heard chants of this is what democracy looks like in Occupy Wall Street and in protests that have shook us loose over the last decade. But if we are only looking at protesting, only at resisting, we are not building the institutions that will cultivate the new culture, the new economic systems that can free us from this current situation. More and more, I am seeing ancient wisdoms and practices brought forward to help us heal from the undemocratic, alienating, and sociopathic values embedded in our tyrannical and oligarchic institutions. Frameworks like the Resist and Build framework have been developed to help guide our way. Or, as the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network puts it, there's an urgency to both resist these trends and to build an alternative system for a just and sustainable future. Resistance without a clear vision of the alternative risks merely reforming the current system, while building the alternative without roots and movements of resistance with leadership from those on the front lines of struggle risks both being exclusionary to these folks and their communities and being co-opted by reactionary status quo forces. So we need both of these movements and energies working together to build something different. So for us, legal professionals, or so-called legal professionals, we should expand our attention from the law as it relates to a particular business to we as people exist in many spheres other than the legal sphere, and we have concerns that exceed legal concerns. We need a revolution of values if we actually want to move towards democracy. If we are truly deserving and desiring, I believe we are deserving, if we are truly desiring our ability to learn and speak and decide for ourselves and our communities. And you can see a little of that here from the Just Transition framework developed by Movement Generation and the Climate Justice Alliance. And so when we look at the rules of professional conduct, how do those values that our clients are bringing to us and that we are bringing into the conversation actually lead to us providing competent legal advice and legal services that are within the existing rules of professional conduct? So it matters for attorneys who work to create institutions and help institutions use legal tools to further their goals. And so sometimes clients come to us and they're super experienced and they're super confident and they know exactly what they want. And we are just the providers of purely technical advice, like is shown here in the Model Rule of Professional Conduct 2.13. You can accept that and you can do that, but you don't have to do that, as is said in 2.12 here, because it is proper for attorneys to refer to moral and ethical considerations when giving legal advice. Those considerations, these values, they shape the advice that we give, the institutions that we will create, and how we will help those institutions. So this rule, 2.13, Also recognizes that inexperienced clients may need more help in recognizing the moral and ethical considerations involved in creating their organizations and institutions. It's paternalistic, it's a paternalistic rule in some ways, and that it fails to recognize that inexperienced clients also bring moral and ethical considerations to the table. So I would say more often than not, it's the attorneys who actually need to listen to the moral and ethical considerations that their clients bring to the table. So when we look at the California rules of professional conduct, it also gives us the same space and the same flexibility. What does it mean to be in the client's interests? Is creating organizations and institutions that will support the creation and maintenance of a livable, just world in the client's interests. Our California rules of professional conduct seem to give us latitude when we're advising our clients. And so our clients are wanting to create cooperative structures and bringing their values to the table, values of democracy. And I think it's fair to say that democratic values are pretty universally revered by a lot of folks, even as we recognize the failings of democracy as it exists. So why aren't there more co-ops if we value democracy so greatly? Well, there's a lot of barriers. So there's a lack of awareness. Entrepreneurs aren't taught about cooperatives in business school. There is an awareness, there's not an awareness of resources that are available to cooperatives. And people just don't know what a cooperative is. That's part of the reason that we're putting on this training today. There's also a lack of technical assistance. So there's not a lot of consultants and professionals who are experienced in cooperatives, although that's changing, and hopefully we're helping make that change. There's not a lot of attorneys around the country that have an experience in cooperatives and democratic organizations. And so these barriers, as well as a lack of awareness in government and legal and regulatory barriers, prohibit the growth of cooperative economies. But we can look internationally, and we've seen cooperative economies flourish when there is that awareness, when there is that technical assistance, when there is that government support. And so that's a little bit about the what and the why of democracy and cooperatives. And so, what is a cooperative actually, how is it actually defined? And what does it look like in the wild? And so, for that, I'm going to be turning it over to my coworker, Hope.
All right. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Hi, everyone. My name is Hope Williams, and here to talk about what a cooperative actually is. So, you didn't know this, but there is an international definition of a co-op. This is that. However, this is not the day-to-day definition that I use because I think of a co-op as people-centered enterprises owned, controlled, and run by and for their members to realize their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations. They really bring people together in a democratic and equal way. But again, what actually is a cooperative? Well, it depends on who you're speaking to. If it's a legal entity, let's assume a cooperative attorney. For them, a cooperative is a legally formed cooperative corporation or a legal structure. Rather than forming as a cooperative corporation, some attorneys will suggest utilizing an limited equity cooperative, or I'm sorry, a limited liability company, an LLC, or a general stock corporation with the cooperative ideals codified in the governing documents. For an accountant or tax lawyer, it's a tax category. To them, cooperatives are defined by tax treatment, namely under subchapter T, the taxation of cooperative organizations. Lastly, a set of practices, values, and principles. For cooperative activists, a cooperative is a group of people working together on the basis of cooperative principles and values with no concern with being a legal entity. So, whether you define a co op as a legal entity, a tax category, or a set of shared values, the real magic happens in how they operate. And that brings us to the core of it all, the cooperative principles that make co ops truly different. And let's be real, capitalism as we know it is all about maximizing shareholder return. It's a system that really incentivizes wealth, not work. And then here we are, plot twist, here comes cooperatives. Co ops share the wealth, bringing power back to the people who are actually doing the work. Legally, when we think about it, really anything can be a co op if they operate under a set of practices, values, and principles. So, what are those practices, values, and principles? These are internationally recognized and first developed by displaced artisans, really displaced because of the mechanization and automation during the Industrial Revolution in Rochdale, England. And these values and practices have guided cooperatives for generations, offering a foundation for solidarity and self determination. But fast forward to today, and history is really repeating itself as artificial intelligence has entered the scene via automation. But we don't just have to stand around and watch it happen. We can build a different future. Cooperatives are not just an alternative, they're a blueprint for a democratic, fair, and people powered economy. By following the Rochdale 7 guiding principles, we can create an economy that values people over profit. And the values are open and voluntary membership, democratic control, member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among co ops, and concern for community. All right. All right. So back to it. What is a cooperative? A cooperative is a business in which people using it own it, just members all deciding things for their benefit, not some other investors. And cooperatives work on democratic terms. So they vote, they elect officials, and even participate in deciding the ways that things should be done. And the great news is that cooperatives exist to benefit their members. And the whole point is to put people ahead of profits. So co-ops are really, really neat. And I'm going to pass it to Ricardo now, who's going to go into the difference between the types of co-ops and how they work.
Thanks, Hope. Yeah, so that was a little bit about defining cooperatives. And so if cooperatives are member-owned, member-controlled, and member-benefiting organizations, companies, enterprises, then what types of cooperatives can or exist? So cooperatives can take many forms. They're cooperatively owned cafes, grocery stores, banks, childcare arrangements. You can probably think of some cooperatives that you might know. Um, these examples and the ones that we're about to share demonstrate the diversity of cooperatives that are out there. So let's discuss some of the common types of cooperatives and how they differ from each other, but also how they're united by those same set of principles that Hope just shared. So some of the most well-known cooperatives in the US grew out of the agricultural sector. So these agricultural cooperatives can be marketing, supplier, or producer cooperatives. They function by combining the volume and output of members and leveraging the stronger bargaining and marketing power of the collective whole to build a large brand and or to access discounts and favorable business contracts. So, two examples here are Organic Valley, which are small farmers collectively owning, cooperatively owning Organic Valley, and also Sunkist. So another example of an agricultural cooperative is the Dairy Farmers of America. the DFA is the second largest agricultural cooperative in the United States. So their membership is composed of small dairy farmers who pay dues and contribute dairy output in exchange for benefits like the DFA brand and mark, as well as discounts for things like machinery and guaranteed buyers. So the members in this case are the dairy farmers. And they also receive an annual dividend that is based on the volume of dairy that they produced. So that's some of that patronage, and we'll get into what patronage is later in this training. Another type of co-ops, when we're talking about co-op sectors, is consumer cooperatives. So, when it comes to consumer cooperatives, the underlying incentive is to negotiate better deals or quality for its members. So, in this case, the shoppers, the consumers. America's first successful co-op was actually formed by Benjamin Franklin to provide insurance for homes. But what are some other examples that exist today? So, the PCC community markets, based in Washington State, began as a food buying club of 15 Seattle families in 1953. Since then, their priorities have changed, but their mission to ensure good food that nourishes their communities still continues. And so that's an example of a consumer cooperative. Another that people are probably very familiar with is the REI cooperative. And I'll be explaining a little bit more about them in a second. And one last example of a consumer cooperative is the Mariposa Food Cooperative in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So they're a really beautiful example that you can look into their story to learn more. So when we're thinking about member benefiting, member controlled, uh, what does that look like in a consumer co-op? So looking at REI as an example of a consumer co-op, the underlying member incentive for REI is to obtain better pricing and quality for its members. The shoppers who become members are actually part owners of the cooperative, and in turn, they can vote on the board of directors and they can receive an annual dividend from REI. The annual dividend is usually equivalent to about 10% of the members' qualifying purchases from that year. So that's an example of a consumer cooperative. Credit unions are also a type of co-op. They're usually nonprofit entities that are tax exempt under 501c 14 of the federal tax code. And credit unions are owned and controlled by the people who bank there and use their services. So members of these credit unions can vote for the volunteer board of directors that manages the credit union. So members also receive a share of the profits from the credit union. So, for example, a typical credit union can pay out dividends to members in proportion to their level of involvement. The more that each member uses a credit union's qualifying services, the greater their dividend. And so qualifying services may include things like taking out a loan for a car or a house, setting up a CD account, or opening up a retirement account. And one example that I like to point to is the Cooperative Center Federal Credit Union in Berkeley, California. And I point to it because it really shows how many people don't understand that these credit unions are cooperatives. They're democratic institutions in our communities that can be re-democratized if members join together and become more active. And so there's a great story of worker cooperative advocates in the Berkeley area deciding that they needed to find ways to get more capital to worker co-ops. So they opened accounts at this Cooperative Center Federal Credit Union and started voting on worker co-op advocates onto the board to start changing the policies of the credit union to allow for more capital to worker co-ops. Another type of cooperative is a housing co-op. So when we think about housing and housing rights and property rights, it's really just a bundle of rights. And so we can take some of these rights and distinguish them from each other. And in that way, we can develop housing cooperatives that are non-extractive. And housing cooperatives can come in many shapes and sizes. They can include townhouses, garden apartments, mid and high-rise apartments, single-family homes, student housing, senior housing, and mobile home parks. So housing cooperatives pool together purchasing power to buy property. The key aspect in any cooperative is democratic control by its members. So to achieve an agreed upon objective, democratic control is typically accomplished through governance by volunteer board members elected from the entire membership. So, ownership of land, when we're talking about it, like I just mentioned, is these bundle of responsibilities and rights. So, when we are owning homes and assuming a large bundle of rights to possess, to occupy, to build, to use, to transfer, what we're doing with housing cooperatives is we're starting to take those things apart, um, and so that the housing can become permanently affordable if that's what the members want, and to restrict some of the use and transferability of that housing. And so, an example of a housing cooperative is the Berkeley Student Housing Cooperative, which has 17 houses, three apartment complexes, and hundreds of member resident owners. Another type, I'll say, of housing cooperatives, or maybe just adjacent, but still one that we like to promote, is the limited equity housing cooperative. And so this is really a model meant to provide long-term stability and affordability under democratic control of its members. So that is definitely a housing cooperative. But the one that's sort of just adjacent, um, but a little bit different, is the community land trust. So I'm bringing it up here in this context because a lot of people, a lot of clients, when they're coming to attorneys and thinking through housing models that might be right for them, two common forms are the housing co-op, the limited equity housing cooperative, and the community land trust. And so community land trusts actually began after World War II and provided an avenue for African American farmers to access land. And so we can use community land trusts not only for housing, but for land in general. So they were searching for a way to help sharecroppers and tenant farmers who were systematically forced off of their land when they attempted to register to vote, to come together collectively to try to buy and own land and farm that land together. And so, in the words of Charles Sherrod, who was helping form the first community land trust, with land, a man holds in his hand the mechanism to control his destiny. So, community land trusts structurally have a tripartite board, and it's usually a nonprofit that is the legal entity for a community land trust. And so there's a tripartite board where a third of the members of the board are residents, a third are experts helpful to the land trust, and a third are community members. So that is a little bit about community land trusts. And the final type of cooperative, or second to last type of cooperative that we're going to be talking about, is my personal favorite, is the worker cooperative. So, as the name suggests, worker cooperatives are owned by a group of workers. This is in contrast to a consumer cooperative business where the members are the shoppers, as opposed to the people who work there. So, worker cooperatives are also described sometimes as employee owned. And just to note that all worker cooperatives are employee owned businesses, but not all employee owned businesses are cooperatives. So, in other words, there are types of employee owned businesses besides cooperatives. So, a common example is the of an employee owned business are ESOPs, employee stock ownership programs. So ESOPs are set up as a stock ownership retirement plan for employees and are usually used in larger companies. But a lot of times, those ESOPs do not provide any more participation in governance or management to the workers. It is purely a financial benefit for the workers to tie their interests with the owners and to become owners themselves. So when we're talking about member-owned, member-controlled, and member benefiting, what does that look like in a worker co-op? So let's take the Rainbow Grocery as a case study for a worker-owned cooperative. So in contrast to REI, a consumer cooperative, at Rainbow Grocery, the members are the workers. The worker owners at Rainbow Grocery share in the governance and decision making, and they all have a vote in things like workplace benefits and vacation days. All the workers also receive a share of the profits, which is paid out based on their patronage of the cooperative. In worker co-ops, patronage is typically measured in terms of hours. So, in some cooperatives, like the Arizmendi Association, patronage can also be measured by other things, like the number of years that you've been working there. So, unlike at REI, people who shop at Rainbow Grocery don't have the option of becoming members because the workers are the members. And the last type of cooperative that I'm going to be talking about today is the hybrid or multi-stakeholder cooperative. So it's possible to have a multi-stakeholder cooperative that is owned and controlled by more than one type of membership class. So um, here's an example, the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And it has four types of owners. It has community owners, so investor owners, resident owners, and staff owners. So community owners are people from the community who want to invest in this cooperative to see it succeed. Investor owners are people who might not live in the area in the San Francisco East Bay, but want to participate and contribute to the success of this cooperative and invest in it. And Sustainable Economies Law Center was part of the process in developing the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And we worked with the founders to make sure that investors didn't have excessive control or receive excessive return on their investments so that the members, the community owners, the resident owners, the staff owners were the ones really making the decisions, even though investor owners do have a right to vote for the board. The resident owners of East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative are the people who live in the properties or work in the commercial properties of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And finally, the staff owners. So there's a staff making sure that the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is functioning and moving forward. And so they are also owners. So this is a type of multi-stakeholder cooperative. And just as a note, when you start moving into multi-stakeholder or hybrid cooperatives, it can get very complicated. And so you should definitely seek resources on how to structure power sharing, decision making, etc., when it comes to a hybrid or multi-stakeholder cooperative. So I'm going to transition it now to some fun stuff, the co-op legal issues that Hope is going to talk to us about. Hope?
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Yes, here now to talk about the fun stuff. So, when forming or operating a cooperative, there are a few key legal areas to navigate, including entity choice, employment law, governance, and how money flows through a cooperative, aka taxes and securities law. So, cooperatives have very unique legal needs, and different types of lawyers handle different aspects. Employment lawyers address workplace rules, worker protections, and compliance. Securities lawyers navigate fundraising and investment regulations. Tax lawyers, bookkeepers, and accountants manage cooperative taxation, which sometimes overlaps with employment law. And the real challenge lies in the fact that, unlike traditional businesses, cooperatives emphasize democracy, shared ownership, and community benefit. This means attorneys must adapt their legal strategies to align with cooperative principles rather than conventional corporate norms. So, how do you begin to determine the type of legal support your cooperative needs? Glad you asked. You can begin with entity choice. So, in deciding on an entity, significant factors to keep in mind are how the co op will be taxed, whether it will fall into subchapter T or another tax structure, how decisions will be made, and whether members will have direct control of the governance. It's also essential to determine the legal status of members in regard to the co-op, as whether they're consumers, producers, residents, or investors, and to establish sources of funds either from member contributions, grants, or outside investment. Now, from our experience at SELC, working with cooperatives, the most commonly used legal structures include cooperative corporations and limited liability corporations, and even nonprofits, which are structured to follow cooperative principles. Remember the 7 principles from England back in the Industrial Revolution that we talked about earlier? Well, choosing the appropriate legal structure is critical in the long-term prosperity of your co-op, since it has direct influences on taxation, governance, member roles, and funding opportunities. So even if this entity type isn't the right fit, many cooperatives still incorporate cooperative principles into their governance structure to ensure democratic control, equitable participation, and long-term sustainability. So let's kick things off and talk about cooperative corporations. These entities are built for cooperation right out the gate, meaning they come with baked-in legal structures that support democratic ownership and member control. They live here. Where to find it? If you are outside of California, you can visit the website of the National Cooperative Business Association, or NCBA, or CLUSA for short, CLUSA, which is the US representative to the International Cooperative Alliance, or ICA, to find cooperative statutes in your state. In California, cooperative corporations are regulated under the California Cooperations Code, where it starts with section 12200, which establishes the legal foundation for their formation, operation, and adherence. Now, remember, cooperatives are unique business entities that prioritize member benefit over maximizing financial returns for external shareholders. Cooperatives are operated at cost to members, which means they aim to break even and distribute excess earnings to members or reinvest in the enterprise rather than the generating profits for outside investors. So that decision making is democratic, and voting rights are not tied to financial commitment co-ops, which operate under a one member, one vote basis. So your voice is just as valuable as the next person's, no matter how much you paid. In order to maintain member control while allowing for outside investment, cooperatives place a 15% limit on capital returns so that outside investors will not try to put profit over your cooperative principles. And members are then not incentivized to become capitalist extremists. Instead of distributing profits based on capital contribution, patronage dividends are distributed based on members' use or contribution, hours worked, wages earned, or purchases made. And in addition, cooperatives receive special tax deductions for patronage dividends like subchapter T taxation, making distributions to members exempt from double taxation as corporate earnings. We'll go into that a little bit further. Ricardo will talk about that more. And lastly, in California, the term cooperative is reserved in the official business name for legally registered cooperatives, safeguarding the integrity of the model. But what if your group can't or doesn't want to formally register as a cooperative, but still wants to embrace cooperative values? We have some good news. There are other ways to incorporate these principles into different legal entities. So let's explore. Enter limited liability companies. Remember, cooperatives play by their own rules. Their legal and financial structures are totally different from traditional businesses, and that's what makes them awesome. No corporate greed, no top down control, just a business model that actually puts people first. And while cooperative corporations are particularly designed to enforce cooperative principles under law, they also entail corporate formalities such as meeting requirements, reporting requirements, the presumption that workers for a corporation are employees, and restrictions on how relationships within the cooperative may be structured. LLCs offer a more flexible and accessible form of cooperative ownership. And some of the advantages of an LLC are ease of formation, less government regulation, and pass-through taxation, which evades corporate taxes on the entity. They can also be a better option for undocumented workers since they allow co-ownership without the use of a social security number. Members of co-ops must write their operating agreement with care so that decision-making remains democratic and profit sharing is equitable. Cooperative corporations and limited liability corporations are two of the most common legal entities we see folks use when starting a cooperative. But there's a secret third one that we see a lot of people use, and that's the nonprofit corporation. So here are the main factors to consider. First and foremost, consideration is purpose. The most important consideration is purpose. What will your organization do? Who will benefit from it? These are important questions. And once you answer them, then you can begin to think whether or not you can articulate an exempt purpose that the IRS will recognize. The second factor you should consider is the amount of control that you and other members would like to have over the organization. And one of the cooperative principles, remember, is democratic control by the members. And this is difficult to achieve in a nonprofit organization because the law really limits the control of interested persons. Basically, anyone who performs paid work or for the organization, control of interested persons to no more than 49% of board seats. Third factor is funding. Cooperatives can have investors who acquire an interest in the future returns of the organization. Nonprofits, on the other hand, have donors who make contributions of grants to the organization, and if the organization has a 501c3 exemption, then can claim a tax deduction for the contribution. Lastly, profits. Cooperatives can distribute their profits to their members, but nonprofits can't. They cannot. They can pay their workers reasonable wages, but any profits must be reinvested in the organization's exempt purpose. So, purpose, control, funding, profits. We can point to a few examples, but why not point to the greatest of all time, the GOAT, us, Sustainable Economies Law Center. So really, if it's a nonprofit and a cooperative had a baby, it would equal our wild and wacky operation, a worker self-directed nonprofit. And We have a lot of guides on our website at the selc.org. You can check them out. And really, ultimately, entity choice is determined by the particular needs of a cooperative. And keep in mind that entity choice is not permanent. Cooperatives can shift and restructure as they grow. And always remember that whether it's a cooperative corporation, an LLC, a nonprofit, or a worker self directed nonprofit, all of these entities can be infused with the spirit of cooperative principles and values. Which brings us to a critical question. How does entity choice impact the way that workers are treated in cooperatives? And I'm going to hand it over to Ricardo.
Thanks, Hope. Employment law. Yes, you have to think about it if you're going to be starting a cooperative, whether it's a housing cooperative and people are going to be contributing to the functioning of this housing co-op or consumer co-op, or maybe some of the members are going to be participating in stocking or checkout or in a worker co-op. So, true or false? Maybe I just answered this question. Co-ops do not have to worry about employment laws. False. Because co-op members might be considered employees under labor and employment laws. So the co-op might need to comply with laws that are designed to protect workers. So employment laws even cover collaborative, democratic, participatory, and accountable economic relationships that are created in a cooperative economy. And before I continue, because this is just an intro into employment law, it's worth mentioning that one of the other considerations between a limited liability company and a cooperative corporation comes into play with employment law. Members of an LLC are less likely to be classified as employees than members of a worker cooperative corporation. That means that cooperatively structured LLCs probably don't have to comply with a lot of the employment laws, while cooperatives incorporated under the California Cooperative Corporation will have to comply with employment laws. The LLC makes for less overhead, but also for less protection. If you can't afford to pay yourself minimum wage while you're starting up your cooperative or your client, then you should probably look into the LLC. If you can pay yourselves at least minimum wage and comply with other employment laws, you could probably incorporate as a cooperative corporation. So if you can't be classified as an employee because of, for example, documentation status, LLCs are also a great option. But what does it mean to have employees? Well, it means jumping through a lot of hoops. Minimum wage, workers' compensation, overtime, payroll taxes, OSHA compliance. And what we've seen over the years is that a lot of these regulations and a lot of these laws have been written and co-written by large corporations. So that in the end, the only ones who are able to jump through all of these hoops are the very large and wealthy corporations and become big burdens for people who are trying to create smaller businesses, cooperatively owned businesses. So that's part of the reason that we are here at the Sustainable Economies Law Center is to help people understand employment law so that they can start their enterprises and to get them to lower their risks. So most employment laws are strictly enforced. You will get a penalty if you are found not to be in compliance. In the long run, it can cost your business more if you do not comply than if you do comply with these laws. And knowing the law is the best tool for business owners to minimize these costs while creating a safe workplace and a safe cooperative. So, how does the law work when it comes to employment law? So, employment laws exist at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. At each level, the law creates a floor, a baseline requirement for how an employer should act. So, when in doubt, follow four simple rules. One, that the most local law is the most strict. So, follow that. So, for example, in Oakland, there's a higher requirement for time off and sick time reporting than at the California state level, as one example. Also, most employment laws are non-negotiable. So, for example, if you and your employees agree to pay themselves less than minimum wage, it's still illegal, even if everyone agrees to it. And you will be responsible for paying them how much they are entitled to by law. The third is assume that workers are employees and then work your way backwards from there if not. And the fourth is if you're confused, talk to an attorney or come to one of our legal cafes. So, who enforces employment laws? I'm going to be very quick with this, but at the California state level, it's the Department of Industrial Relations, Division of Labor Standards and Enforcement. So that is the primary body that enforces wage and hour laws, child labor laws, etc. In addition to the state level agencies, there's agencies that operate at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Labor, to enforce similar laws. And then at the local level, there's the city manager. So it's really important for you to understand that these laws are strictly enforced, that even if everyone agrees to them, you still have to abide by them. And the most important factors in whether someone is considered an employee or not is actually the power that they have in the cooperative. So you can write whatever you want into your legal agreements and on paper, but if there was ever a claim that an employee brought forward a lawsuit that a worker or a member of a cooperative brought against the cooperative to say, hey, I should be treated as an employee and I deserve all of these rights, the judge or the trier of fact and law are going to look at the actual facts and circumstances of your cooperative. How is power distributed? How much power does each individual member have in deciding their work, in deciding the fate of the organization? How hard is it for them to be fired? And how easy is it for them to fire other people? So, how do you distribute power and decision making in a cooperative? Hope is going to help us get an understanding of that and cooperative governance structures.
So, to begin, the first corporation, well, in the beginning, the first corporation was used to raise money in England to fund expeditions of colonization, tools of imperialism aimed to extract. And corporate structures are still essentially unchanged, still defined as feudal hierarchies with centralization of power at the top. So, fair warning, in lacking intentionality, cooperatives can easily replicate these primary power structures, perpetrating hierarchies instead of eradicating them. History, however, shows us that there are many proven models of governance available to enable economic democracy and worker control. More significantly, cooperative governance does not rely upon a single legal structure. Although cooperative corporations provide an inbuilt framework for democratic decision making, LLCs and nonprofits can be cooperatives if democratic governance principles are integrated within their organizational documents. So, through exercising power intentionally, cooperatives can deliver equal decision making, accountability, and long term stability. But you got to practice the govern into governance. And good cooperative governance isn't about checking boxes. It's about making sure the board and management actually do work in the best interests of the cooperative and members. It helps with keeping an eye on what's happening, avoiding misspent resources, eliminating unnecessary drama, and improving accountability and transparency. Good governance basically keeps the cooperative on an even keel instead of into chaos. But here's the thing, there is no one size fits all governance model. Each cooperative has to figure out what's best for its members and purpose. And if we are not intentional about designing governance to disrupt traditional power structures, we may well end up recreating the same old hierarchies we're trying to escape. So let us build something better. But before we can figure out how to govern, we must first define what we are governing for. What kind of power dynamics do we want to cultivate? What kind of organizational culture will actually support justice and equity in practice? So, you want to begin by aligning your organization's practices with justice and equity, which requires a shared understanding of what those values really mean in your context. Governance is not just about structures, it's about shaping the culture that gives those structures meaning. Invisible structures, such as culture, values, and unspoken norms, often shape and condition the more visible structures of an organization. And governance tools and processes are just that. They are tools. But like any technology, they must be embedded within a clear ethical framework to ensure they serve justice rather than replicate harm. And institutions are only as healthy as the culture that supports them. The same applies to organizations. Governance is not simply rules and procedures, but about developing a shared culture that sustains accountability and equity. Only by determining these questions can we create governance systems that actually reflect our values. And here's where cooperatives really break the mold. In business, cash is usually king. Spend the most money and you've got the most influence. But cooperatives, they defy capitalism because at the center of cooperative decision making, regardless of how much you pay in, there is a beautiful but radical idea: one member, one vote. For in a cooperative, power isn't a saleable commodity. So let's be honest, all things considered, it may feel like self governance is a lot. Deciding together, switching between tasks, and listening to all of your voices takes effort. But democratic leadership doesn't have to be a headache fest. Let's talk about how to do it without being submerged in meetings and decision fatigue. And this is what many folks think governance looks like in a cooperative. And the key is to be intentional. Cooperatives do not need to look like everyone doing everything. With lots of long meetings about our feelings, I mean, controversial take, I actually think that feelings are the bedrock of governance, but it probably does in some cooperatives. So how do we avoid an organization with either no clear structure or the kind of confusion that makes everyone feel like they have to do everything? How do we structure governance in a cooperative corporation? If you incorporate as a corporation, you are required to have a board, but the composition of that board can appear very different depending on the needs of your cooperative. There are a few main options when considering how to structure your cooperative's board governance. Here are two common models for cooperative board governance. One, is having a relatively small board of directors that is elected by the members, similar to Alvarado Street Bakery. And this bakery has over 180 worker owners. So it might not make sense for all of them to sit on the board. The major principle, power not equaling money, is that of the one member, one vote, meaning voting power is not tied to financial investment. And a smaller board tends to work better in larger organizations. And while the board typically must be at least 3 members, there are not any restrictions on who those members can be. So members of the cooperative are free to sit on the board. The other option, uh, all of a cooperative's member, every cooperative member can sit on the board if desired. I mean, that's how Arizmendi bakeries are ran. That way, all of the members directly control the operations of the company by all being on the board. This second type of cooperative, where all of the workers are involved in management decisions, is typically known as a collective. So management and governance are still important, and it's generally the same people playing different roles. Workplace democracy through voting or electing representatives is just one way to practice cooperation and may not be as relevant for a small cooperative. Now, in our nonprofit, we've developed a different model for cooperative governance. Rather than concentrating governance decisions at the top, we've woven them into different levels of the organization, making our structure more dynamic and responsive. I think that the Sustainable Economies Law Center's governance structure, I see it as a river, alive, moving, changing, and flowing with the needs of our organization and communities. Effective self-governance isn't about rigid rules or static structures. It's about adaptability and balance and knowing when to let go and when to redirect the current. So, if you are curious about how we've made this work, we have published all of our policies out online for you to adapt, borrow, and replicate. You can visit them at our website at the selc.org. We've covered a lot about cooperative governance, how it's not just about having a board, but about structuring decision making in ways that reflect cooperative values, whether it's a small elected board, a collective board model, or something in between. Governance should be designed to serve the cooperative members, not just follow corporate norms. We've also talked about how governance is not so much procedure and rules, it's culture. If we're not vigilant, we're going to create the same hierarchies that we're wanting to move away from. That's why governance has to be dynamic, flexible, and adaptive to the needs of the people in the cooperative. In the last legal area, we are going to cover one that is essential for attorneys and their clients to fully grasp. It is how money flows through a cooperative. And I'm going to hand it off to Ricardo.
Thanks, Hope. Yeah, this is our final section. Thanks for making it this far in our introduction to cooperatives and the law. And this last section is on taxes and how money flows through a cooperative. It's actually pretty rad. So, I'm just gonna throw down the Holy Grail in at the top of this that when we're thinking about cooperatives and taxes, there is a foundational case, the Puget Sound Plywood versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue, 1965, that really gives us the definition of worker cooperative as a type of cooperative, but also really moved forward the tax law as it applied to all cooperatives. So um, I'm not going to read this definition. You have the slides and you can read it. but I'm going to get into the substance of this case and how it impacts cooperatives and how money flows through a cooperative. So, there is a special tax status for cooperatives, and it's called Subchapter T. And to be eligible to uh, get this special tax status, which allows for pass-through taxation, essentially, avoiding the double taxation of getting taxed at the entity level and then at the individual income level. To be eligible for this Subchapter T tax status, you have to be operating on a cooperative basis. And so, how did this Puget Sound plywood case define what it means to be operating on a cooperative basis? So, the court listed three guiding principles. The first is subordination of capital. So this is both as regards to the control over the cooperative undertaking, so the control of the members, and as regards regarding the ownership of the pecuniary benefits arising therefrom. Very fancy legal terms. But, basically that patronage dividend that we're talking about, the benefit to members back to them based on their contribution or participation in the cooperative. The second is democratic control by the worker members. So it's not just any type of control by members, but democratic. So one member, one vote themselves. And the third, the vesting in and allocation among the worker members of all fruits and increases arising from their cooperative endeavor. That is, the excess of operating revenues over the costs incurred in generating those revenues in proportion to the worker members' active participation in the cooperative endeavor. So, judges use flowery language. They love it. But this is the definition of what it means to be operating on a cooperative basis, and therefore to get that subchapter T tax exemption. Okay, I've been talking through this presentation, and so has Hope, and we've been using terms profits, surplus, patronage. What does it mean? Well, let me help you all out. So, profits. Profits, when we're thinking about it legally and in the tax code, is the net income after expenses during a fiscal year attributable to non-member labor. So another way we can think about profits is extraction of benefit, of economic financial benefit from non-members. Surplus is the net income after expenses that is attributable to member labor. So, in a worker cooperative, the members who are contributing and there's some leftover money at the end of the year after expenses, we call that surplus. And patronage dividend is a distribution that a cooperative pays to its members, sort of like an annual bonus. And that's distributed based on their contribution and participation in the cooperative. So, and when we're thinking about subchapter T, that surplus is where you can get that tax benefit. So any surplus, so that net income after expenses generated by members is the stuff that you can say, we're not going to get taxed on this at the entity level, which means that the members can receive more of the benefit of their contribution to the cooperative. So, when we're talking about cooperative ownership structures and in relation to profits and surplus and patronage, it can be a challenging issue. And so I'm going to just go over some more terms and then we'll see it in practice and what it can look like. So, I think cooperatives are great because they challenge this common notion and point out how silly it is that a typical business is basically designed to make rich people richer. So, I think of the role of money should be to reward people for the tangible contributions that they make to our communities. And so when we're thinking about it in the cooperative context, we can think about the money that's coming into a cooperative and how it's getting distributed to its workers this way. So we can think about wages. So wages are paid throughout the year to its members as workers in a worker cooperative. And then when we're thinking about cooperative ownership, we can think about member capital accounts. So a member capital account is started when a worker becomes a member and they buy in. So usually there's some buy-in to become a member of a worker cooperative. So when they do that, they create a member capital account and that starts their member equity. Then the other thing that goes into their member capital account is the retained patronage. So when cooperatives have this surplus at the end of the year and they distribute it to their members, a lot of times they'll pay some in cash and then the rest they'll keep in the cooperative as operating capital. But on their books, they'll say, this is the amount that's owed to this individual member as retained patronage within the cooperative. So, and then they'll get that later when they leave the co-op. And then there's patronage, which is the ownership dividend. So this is the annual surplus that's distributed to members as owners. So it's when the patronage distribution is given out, part of it is paid in cash and part of it is retained in the member's capital account. So, and one thing to note is that typically the minimum amount to be paid out in cash is 20%. And why is that? It's because the year that the member of the cooperative, is given that patronage distribution, they have to pay taxes on the entire amount. So they have to be paid at least 20% in cash so that they're able to pay the taxes on that full amount of their patronage distribution. But later, when they leave the co-op, or maybe they get paid that patronage distribution later, they don't have to pay taxes again on it. They've already paid taxes on it. So, how does this actually look in practice? Let's take seven dwarves as an example, or in this case, five. So, we have our dwarves, and they have their cooperative mining co-op, and they've decided, we're gonna form our cooperative, we're gonna do it right, and we're gonna keep track of all of these numbers and accounts and everything. So they decided that their initial investment, their buy-in to become members of the co-op, is going to be $10,000. So each dwarf puts in the $10,000 buy-in, and now they're all members of this co-op. So what does this look like? Well, when we're looking at a cooperative and trying to determine surplus versus profit, how do we determine that? Well, surplus, remember, is all of that net income that's generated by members, and the profit is the net income generated by non-members. So their income for 1 year working in their mining cooperative was $650,000. Their costs and expenses were $539,000. So that includes materials, the wages that they paid to themselves, operating expenses, depreciation, etc. So when we take our income and minus our costs and expenses, we have our net income. So how does that get distributed? Well, there was actually a couple dwarves that were working who were not members of the cooperative yet. So the net income generated by them, the profits, was $11,000. And so that's going to be retained earnings and it can stay in the cooperative. Then there was the surplus. $100,000 was generated by the members. And so how are we going to distribute that surplus and how is it actually going to get paid out to the cooperative members? Let's find out. So we have our $100,000 of surplus generated by the members of the co-op. And these dwarves were really smart and they wrote into their bylaws at the beginning, you know what, every year we should always just like put aside a certain amount of surplus into the co-op as operating capital that we're not going to distribute to ourselves. So they decided 25% every year. So 25% is $25,000, and that just stays in the collective account for the cooperative. So that's not distributed to any of the members. It's there to support the operations, and growth of their mining co-op. So then we have $75,000 left to be distributed as dividends to the members. So remember that we need to pay some in cash and some is going to be retained in the co-op. And so that cash payment to the members of the co-op is going to be 37,500 this year, so 50%. And the rest is going to be put into the member capital accounts. So it's going to be retained patronage for those members of the co-op. Then we have our five cooperative dwarf members, Sleepy, Bashful, Doc, Happy, Dopey, all receiving their individual patronage dividends based on their contribution that year to the co-op. And let's just say that they said just the number of hours in proportion that we work to each other. So that's how it's distributed. Then that retained patronage that they weren't paid in cash that year is going to be paid out later. So, how is that going to look later? Let's look at Bashful and see what it looks like for an individual cooperative member. So, Bashful's member capital account was started with that initial buy-in. That's going to stay with Bashful the entire time that Bashful is a member of the cooperative. And so they have that $10,000 buy-in. Then in year one, they had that $6,000 retained patronage that was on the books and held by the co-op, but is Bashful's property. So year one, retained patronage was $6,000. Then at the end of year two, Bashful got $4,000 of retained patronage. Maybe the co-op didn't do as well. Maybe Bashful didn't work as much. But Bashful got $4,000 in retained patronage that's held by the co-op. And so what this cooperative, the mining co-op, decided to do was instead of having these member capital accounts balloon and expand year over year as we retain the patronage, we're going to pay out the previous year's patronage dividend the following year. So to make sure that that ballooning doesn't happen. So Bashful is paid that retained patronage distribution from year one, in year two, and in cash. And so year two's retained patronage stays in Bashful's member capital account. So same thing happens in year three. Year three, Bashful only received $1,000 of patronage dividend that was retained in the cooperative. They paid Bashful that $4,000 and so on. And so year over year, this is the way that this cooperative has decided on how to distribute the member capital accounts retained patronage distributions to its members. So, cooperative cash management and stability. So one of the good things about cooperative cash management and stability is that it avoids double taxation. So patronage, that patronage that we were just talking about, is not subject to corporate income tax if you can get that subchapter T tax exemption, even retained patronage. It also means, or it also is a means of retaining cash in the cooperative. So it doesn't discourage long-term planning. So with a limited liability company, sometimes it can be difficult because for limited liability companies, every year all of that money is taxed and it has to go to some of the members. So sometimes it can discourage long-term planning. And the third good benefit of cooperative cash management is that it can be a savings mechanism for its members. So those are some benefits to cooperative cash management. And then how does this actually play out when it comes to decision making in a worker cooperative? So when a cooperative has a decision, it's we're wearing multiple hats. So the worker members are workers, they're also owners, but they're also managers. So let's take the example of raising wages. So maybe when a question comes to the co-op, should we raise our wages? The worker thinks, I need that cash right now. And so they're wanting to raise the wages. But the owner is thinking with that owner mindset and thinking, if we keep our wages low, we're going to get more patronage. And actually, our wages are taxed higher than our patronage. So in the end, I'm going to get more money. I'm just going to have to wait for it. And as a manager, maybe the work or the member is thinking, we need to save for new equipment. So actually, we shouldn't raise wages or find some in between. So this is just one example of how members can think of decision making when it comes to cooperative decisions. The end is near. We are at the end of our training. And so now we're just going to share some resources. So on our website, we have lots of resources. We have actually multiple websites for you to look towards. One is cooplaw.org. So this is an entire website of legal information, and we've started building out state-by-state guides on cooperative law as it applies to cooperatives in the different states around the country. We also have our Think Outside the Box manual, as well as other manuals that really explain how does the law impact worker co-ops, housing co-ops, um, community land trusts, etc. There's also the Cooperative Professionals Guild, which is a national network of attorneys and accountants who serve cooperatives. So it's a community of practice. There's webinars that happen, and it was supported by and incubated by Sustainable Economies Law Center, and now it's its own independent organization. There's also other really good organizations supporting cooperatives out there, like the California Cooperative Development Center, if you're in California. There's cooperative development centers around the country, so you can look at your own state to see if there's one. There's the National Cooperative Business Association, which was mentioned earlier, and they have a lot of resources, like a state-by-state guide on the cooperative statutes for each state. There's the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. So they are the national grassroots membership-based organization of democratic workplaces and worker cooperatives. There's the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network, which is trying to bring multiple types of solidarity economy programs and projects together to help cross-pollinate and support move towards a more just and equitable future. And we have other organizations like Project Equity, etc. So that is that's our presentation for today. I'd like to thank Hope and our interpreters for spending the time with us today, and I hope this was useful for you as well. Take care.